Well, thank you all for coming. I'm going to just start this out by being humble. I'm not the world's best astrophotographer. In fact, I'm still learning every single day. But I'm not the worst astrophotographer. So I think what we're going to go through today is I'm going to talk to you about the equipment. So if you're looking for Christmas gifts, get your pen and paper out, or make some lists. You give it to your significant others so they can go Christmas shopping for you. We're going to talk about kind of the approach in terms of what happens when you go out and try to create these astrophotography pictures. Then we're going to talk a little bit about list processing, which is kind of the art of the science. And then finally, we're going to have a slideshow of some of the members' pictures. And then we'll have some questions and answers. So let's go ahead and get started. Anybody recognize that picture? That's right. It's one of the most famous pictures ever taken. Someday, hopefully we'll get that from the ground, but not at this time. And let's get started. So astrophotography to me is, I got interested in this about 5-6 years ago. I'm a gadget guy, so if you're a gadget person, this is the thing you want to get into. It's a lot of fun making these things work. I travel all over the place with my wife and dog, Spider. We go to the various star parties, we go to dark sky sites. There's a big difference in terms of taking pictures here at Crestview versus going up to Aden, California, or down to Borrego Springs. It's a world of difference. But we travel and been fortunate to go all over. You'll see some of the pictures we've taken at various places, and we've pointed those out. And also, for me, astrophotography, it's the next step in the evolution of my astronomy hobby, which is moving on from visual into electronically assisted astronomy. Because one of the things that you have access to is the new cameras. They're the best eye out there. They'll beat the human eye every single time, and you can see a lot more. And for the club, and where we're doing outreach, it allows us to bring all these different objects out there that normally you can't see visually to those people that we're actually having an event for. Okay, so everything starts somewhere, and so these are some of my first shots 5-6 years ago. Humble beginnings, right? So you can see they're out of focus, not in focus, barely visible, and you have to start someplace. And astrophotography will knock you back on your heels every single time, and it really takes a commitment to learn how this thing is done. I will say a lot has changed over the past few years to make it a lot easier, but this is where I started. And so astrophotography, for everyone, it used to be the frontier. It was very expensive to get into. There was all kinds of manufacturers made all kinds of different equipment that you had to have work together. And any engineers in here know that when you get more than 2 pieces of equipment, they have to work together. Chances are high that it's not going to work. And so we were forced to go through kind of that evolution of having this equipment, stitching it together, being frustrated in the dark because it's not talking to each other. Then you throw in software, which was multiple pieces of software that you're trying to run on Windows, drivers not working. It was kind of a nightmare. And then my favorite is, I'm a Mac guy, none of it ran on a Mac. And so you were forced to use a PC. I haven't used a PC laptop in 10 years, so I was a little bit frustrated. So what changed? And actually a lot's changed. The biggest driver in astrophotography recently has been COVID-19. People had to stay home, they couldn't go anywhere, and so they needed a new hobby. And if anyone has tried to order any astronomy equipment over the last couple of years, it's been impossible because there's been a bunch of people getting into the hobby. And so what that has really driven is kind of a whole ecosystem of which to learn from on YouTube. So if you want to learn how to do anything in astrophotography, you could go into YouTube, put in the subject, and you'll find somebody that's already done it. You can learn it very quickly. Also, that Unistellar, which is a kind of a all-in-one telescope. I don't know if anybody has seen it. They make the EV scope. Is kind of the next evolution, I think, in astrophotography. It's not there where it can make very clear, crisp pictures, but I think that technology has really kind of set forth electronically aided astronomy because it has a camera built into the telescope. And then it's also communicating with your iPhone or iPad and you can actually create photographs, which we have several examples later on in the slideshow, and it does a really good job. I think that technology is about 4 or 5 years away from really getting into where astrophotography is today for the mainline equipment. Also, during COVID, if you're interested in taking pictures, you want to show your friends. So now there's a bunch of sites on Facebook, Instagram, all the social media to where you can share your photos. And that's really kind of where people are now buying into the hobby, investing more in the equipment. The biggest thing has been these guys on the end, ZWO. They've been the first of all the manufacturers to really step back and look at all the pieces of equipment and software and integrate it. And that makes a huge difference. No longer do you have the headache of trying to have all these pieces of equipment talk to each other and operate seamlessly, and then have the software kind of layering on top of it. They did it all. They went one generation beyond all the major manufacturers such as Meade and Celestron. And really, those companies are way behind now. If you go online to look at any of the equipment retailers, that's all they're selling. If you're looking at astrophotography videos, that's all they're using. And so they've really stepped astronomy into a whole new dimension, this one company. I don't work for them, I don't get paid by them, but I own all their equipment, and I swear by it because I've tried all the rest of the stuff. And I'll actually show you some of what they've done here in the next couple pages. Also, what has changed is from a compute perspective, the manufacturers have recognized that you're carrying around a computer, whether you realize it or not. It's your phone or your iPad. So you don't need to bring out your iMac, your MacBook, or your PC laptop anymore in the dark to try to take all these pictures, hook cables up to it. Again, this company and a couple of others have figured out how to use those devices wirelessly to connect to all the different devices you need to do astrophotography, which has, again, changed the game. So let's get into the equipment basics of what you need to have or own in order to do astrophotography. So if you're making your Christmas list, get ready. So let's start with the most basic of equipment, which is the telescope. Now I'm going to be up front, and I'm just going to recommend a starting point because, again, I bought them all, I've owned them all, I've sold them all, and I've kind of settled down to my latest iteration of my astrophotography rigs. But if I was going to start today, or I was recommending to somebody, where do you start? What do you buy? These are two of the ones I would recommend. And so with telescopes, bigger is not better. So you don't need to go out and buy a 14-inch Schmidt-Cassegrain or a huge telescope. It's really not recommended for somebody just getting in. The reason for that is you want to start someplace where you have a little bit of forgiveness. And that being in astrophotography is taking a wide field picture. And so using a lower power telescope allows you to do that. So you don't need a very expensive telescope to do it. You can start with the more traditional refractor here, which are commonly found. They're made by a number of manufacturers. That's kind of an expensive one. You could probably get into this for about $400 or $500. The key here with the refractor is you have to have a triplet. And so what I mean by that is some of these refractors have 2 lenses, others have 3. The ones with 2 are called a doublet. And the reason the other ones have 3 is the 3 lenses will focus all the colors of light to a single point, including purple, which the doublet will not. And in the case of visual astronomy, when you're looking through an eyepiece, that's not that bad because your eye is not as sensitive as a camera. But when you're trying to take a picture, boy, let me tell you, that purple is going to stand out. You're going to get coma. You're going to get all kinds of weird things going on in your picture. And so it's best to have a quality lens or a triplet from a refractor perspective. That's a good place to start. 80 millimeters, one of the smaller telescopes you can buy. Again, the next one here is something new on the scene. It's called a RASA. And what this is, again, this is an 8-inch version. They make these in multiple different sizes. 8 inch is kind of the sweet spot. It's different since it has a mirror compared to the refractor, which is pure glass. You're looking through glass. This one here has 2 mirrors. The key here is it's a light bucket because it has 8 inches of aperture, so it's going to collect more light than the refractor. But there's something about it called the F ratio, which is it shoots at f2. And so what this means is the speed of the telescope. So I needed to explain this because this is a key function of astrophotography. It kind of drives everything in terms of decision making and all the mechanics of actually taking a picture. So this is the only math slide I have. So to kind of demonstrate how fast your telescope is, we're gonna take a quick moment to do, again, the math. The F ratio is simply the aperture, right? Actually, the focal length divided by the aperture. The focal length is the path of light, or the light path through the telescope in terms of how long it is, divided by the diameter of the lens. So in the case of this first telescope on the top, this GT81, it has an F ratio of about 5.9. Okay? The bottom one, which is a common SCT, actually on this scope, has a focal ratio of F11. So what does that mean? Well, let's say they're taking a picture at the same point of the sky on the Orion Nebula. Let's say it's 1 arc minute. An arc minute is, if you stood in the middle of the Earth and you counted out 360 segments, that one segment's an arc minute if you made it square. So let's say we're taking a picture of that arc minute, comes through each of the cameras, or each of the telescopes, goes to the same camera, and in the case of the GT81, let's say you collect 100 photons, and all those 100 photons go to 1 pixel on the camera in 1 minute. Right? So that's an example. If you look at what the F11 is, which is kind of twice the F ratio, because you have a longer focal length, it's going to spread that image out to 4 pixels. And each of those pixels is going to collect 25 photons. Same 100 photons, but now they're across 4 pixels. Well, what's that mean? Well, the whole goal of trying to have astrophotography is collect as much light as you can. Well, in that 1 minute, I collected 100 photons per pixel. Lower telescope, I now have 25 per pixel. So if I'm going to have the same exposure, I got to expose that sensor for 4 minutes compared to the top telescope. Why is that a big deal? All right. Go back to having the equipment work, no vibration, no airplanes flying above you, nobody walking by the mount. Having that happen for 1 minute is going to happen a lot more often than it happens for 4 minutes. And so having a 4-minute exposure, you have to have pretty much everything working perfectly, very little error. So the quicker the exposure, the better. And also, from a GT81 perspective, you're having a wider field. So to show what that would look like, here's taking those same telescopes, same camera. And then what we're doing here is we're actually looking at 2 different objects. So the object on the left is the Orion Nebula, and the outer ring here is what that GT81 would see, the little refractor. This little square in here, using the same camera, is what that C14 would see. All right, on this particular object, it's probably not the optimal setup, the C14, because you're looking at just the core of the Orion Nebula. Move over here, the Ring Nebula, again, same setup. Here's the GT81. You're looking at a huge field here. That's the object, that little dot right there. So if I'm trying to scale up that photo, taking this big area here, I'm not going to get the detail. So therefore, the C14 would be a much better selection to take a picture of the Ring Nebula. So again, it goes into, if I'm choosing equipment, I need to look at which objects I want to go ahead and photograph, understand their size, and also, what is my equipment in terms of accuracy? And really what that accuracy comes down to is I'm going to take that C14, which weighs 65 pounds, I have to put it on a mount. That's going to be a big mount. This little GT81 only weighs 20 pounds. I can put that on a much smaller mount and have a little bit more forgiveness in terms of having it being accurate. So let's talk about that. So getting to the mount, taking those telescopes, this is the next major piece of equipment you need to buy. And it has to be, this is where you sink your money.
part of astrophotography is taking the rotation out of the Earth, which is, you don't want to get star trails. So you have to mimic the rotation of the Earth against the sky and actually look at the same piece of sky for as long as you can. Now, if you remember back, it's either going to be 1 minute or 4 minutes or even 10 minutes. The less time you look at the same piece of sky, if you have any errors, they won't show up. If you have any errors and you're looking at the same spot for 10 minutes, they're going to show up. So again, you have to make your choice. So the most popular kind of mount to get for astrophotography is an equatorial. These are a little bit more difficult to set up, but basically the way they work is you align the axis of this mount up with Polaris, which is kind of the center of the rotation of the Earth, if you're looking at it. And then this piece here will rotate back on itself to look, let's say for lack of better terms, look south, and then find the object, and then be able to rotate along the axis that's now aligned with the Earth and not get star trails. And so, here's your Christmas list. Oop. Showing you on my presentation. So, again, this is where more money buys a better mount. So here are 3 options. And again, this goes into which telescope you're going to start with. If you're going to start with that GT81 and you're looking to dabble, you're probably looking at something like right around here. And these mounts are pretty much rated by as much weight as they can carry. And so this particular mount here is rated about 30 pounds. And so that means you can put 30 pounds of equipment up on top, including the counterweight, and be able to photograph whatever you're looking at. Now, optimally, if you're going to do astrophotography, you actually want to come in about 3/4 of that weight, so maybe 20 pounds. But this would be kind of the bare bones weighting or size and cost of an equatorial mount if you're going to get into this. If you're looking at a little bit more common mount, these things here, this CGEM, and these manufacturers, they all kind of use the same manufacturers or suppliers in China. They're all kind of the same. So you'll see the CGEM 2, there's an Atlas mount, there's a EQ6 made by Sirius. They're all the same mount, they're all the same components. But in essence, they all carry around 40 pounds. And this is kind of the intermediate mount I would recommend if somebody is looking a little bit longer term. And also it's a good mount as well for visual. Now, if you're gonna get serious, and in terms of maybe going way up in terms of aperture, putting a lot of scopes or multiple scopes on the same mount, you're looking at something like this. And so these mounts here, when you get up here, these are, I think this, you guys have one up in the observatory.
No, we don't have one.
You don't have an AP?
No.
But these mounts here are very accurate. I've used all 3 of these. This one here, it's turn it on and forget about it. It's an incredible piece of hardware. I've been fortunate enough to get one. I didn't pay that. But you know, again, if you're going to get into this, this is where you need to spend the money. So let's talk about the next big expenditure. So cameras, up until about a year ago, were all CCD. They've since come out with a CMOS sensor, which is a different technology. And in essence, they brought the cost of camera hardware way down. So again, made it accessible to more people. These cameras used to run, I mean, Ken can back me up, I mean, $3,000 to $4,000. And so they literally being cut in half because these CMOS sensors are much less expensive to manufacture. But the key here is you got a choice. You can go what they call mono, which shoots basically in grayscale, or one-shot color. Now, if you're beginning and starting out, one-shot color is the way to go. It shoots just like a DSLR, it shoots in color, and in essence produces a color format, not a color picture, but a format that can be interpreted as color later on with the software, versus a mono camera, which you have to actually take 4 pictures to get a color picture. And you do that by placing a filter in front of the mono camera, whether it's red, green, or blue, And there's a clear one that gets a luminance, and you combine those to make one color frame. So if you're gonna start out with a mono camera, you have to take a lot more shots to end up with a final picture versus a one-shot color, which is capturing all four of those kind of frames in one shot. So in terms of money, these ZWO cameras, they can't be beat. There's another gentleman in the club, he's been doing astrophotography a lot longer than I have. I just sold him one of these cameras. He absolutely loves it. And so he's a convert to this type camera from a CCD. They're really easy to use and very intuitive, and they're integrated fully with software, which makes it a world of difference. The other thing with these CMOS cameras, when you take a picture, one of the big enemies of astrophotography is noise in the picture. And that could be interpreted, if you haven't never seen it before, as it makes the photo grainy. And a lot of that is from sensor noise or heat. These cameras have virtually eliminated that noise to the bare minimum, which makes a big difference, so that when you get all done with taking your pictures, there's less processing of taking that noise out of the picture later on, and you get a much crisper picture as an end result. Okay, and so again, here's a good example. An additional feature of these cameras is they're cooled. So noise comes from a number of sources. First, it's your environment, the atmosphere, turbulence in the atmosphere. You come from vibration in your mount. The two that are the most common, it comes from electrical noise. So you have to apply a charge to the sensor on your camera. And when it does that, sometimes there's some static within that sensor. That gets picked up in the picture. The other one is heat, and that's the most prevalent and the one that shows up the most. So again, when you apply the charge to the sensor, it actually changes it a few degrees, or maybe even less than that. In essence, that shows up as noise in the picture. So what they've done is they've come up with a way to cool these sensors. There's actually a thermoelectric device in the back of these cameras that you can go ahead and dial in to cool it down to either 10 up to 20 degrees less than ambient temperature. And that's gone a long ways to actually remove the noise out of the picture as you're taking them, so that you don't have to do it later on in post-processing. So a lot of advancements in cameras. And then, if you ever gone online and you've looked at these cameras, there's a dizzying array of them. And there's a reason for that. You have to match it to the telescope. And also there's other accessories that go with the telescope that will impact the right camera for what you're trying to do. And the lucky thing is you don't have to do any of the math. You can go out to these websites. Here's one here, astronomy.tools. And they have all kinds of calculators. So you can put in your specific telescope, your specific camera, and your specific accessories. And it'll tell you whether or not that camera is suited or not for that particular setup. I actually did this a couple of weeks ago because I noticed one of my cameras on one of my scopes, I was getting a soft focus. And what I noticed is, here's the example of, I was undersampling. What that meant is I was actually pixelating my own image by not having enough pixels within a certain frame rate or a certain frame size of the picture. So I was getting blocky stars. Well, that proved it. I put in my particulars, and I actually went out and I bought a different camera that has smaller pixels, and that put me in the ideal range for my particular setup. So I didn't have this, I didn't even know about this Astronomy Tools before, but it's a great site. If you actually go on there, they have a lot of other interesting calculators and different things that will help you with visual astronomy, what have you. You'll spend hours looking at this. So let's talk about other stocking stuffers. So one of the critical things for astrophotography is actually focusing. Now, the old finger and thumb method of twisting the dial, taking a picture, that's going to get old really fast. You're not going to be as accurate as some of the newer methods. So one of the methods you can do, the cheapest one, and actually work for a visual tool, is using a bent-off mask. And so you place this over the end of your telescope, take a picture, or in the case if you're doing it visually, it'll give you this pattern. And what you're trying to do is get that center bar in the middle, and it will give you fairly consistent, good focus. Now, again, your eye is not as good as a camera. So what they've come up with nowadays are these electronic motors that connect to software that inspects your picture. And what it will do is it will automatically adjust that focuser to get perfect focus every single time. Not only will it get perfect focus every single time, you can integrate it with your shooting or with your imaging to take a focus run after you finish with a particular sequence of shots. You move to another object, it will automatically refocus for you. So again, you can automate the whole process now. You don't have to go sit there in front of your computer and go through every single step telling the computer what to do and the sequence of events. You could program it all in. I could show up at Crestview, press a button, and walk away. It'll go through 6 or 7 objects before the end of the night, and then I can go enjoy somebody else's telescope and come back to my scope 3 hours later, what have you, and pull the USB drive out, and I have all my photos for the night. So another big item in astrophotography is your mount is never going to be truly accurate unless you're perfectly polar aligned, and it's hard to do. So one of the things they've done is they develop additional capabilities around a guide scope. And you take these guide scopes and you mount them on top of your refractor or scope, taking the main pictures. And what it does, it looks at the same piece of sky. And what it does is, think of it as kind of missile lock for the mount. And so as it's looking at the same piece of sky that you're shooting in your imaging telescope, it'll lock onto a star, and it will tell that mount to stay in that perfect position, so that star will stay on that pixel it has selected. And so what it will do is go correct the mount. If you're having any errors, it'll keep moving the mount for you to keep, again, that star on that pixel, which translates into taking a much more accurate picture in the other camera. And so again, these are almost a necessity. Where we live, we don't have perfect skies, and so there's some turbulence. And this will help you get a much better picture in our environment, given that we're in a high light pollution zone. This will change your pictures, it'll change your life if you can get it to work right. And again, going back to how many pieces of software you have, the ZWO application integrates all of this. Okay, and so last but not least, we get into, again, I want to talk about software and computer. No longer do you have to bring out your laptop. And this here has been the game changer in all of astrophotography. If you're doing this now, virtually, I would venture to guess 90% of all astrophotographers are using one of these. It's actually just a red piece. This is a little Raspberry Pi computer. It's made by that company, ZWO, and it does absolutely everything for you. And so this will talk to your iPhone or iPad wirelessly, and what it will allow you to do is from your iPad, you have access to a sky atlas. I can actually look through the sky, touch an object, and the mount will automatically slew to that object. I can go ahead and also do an automatic polar alignment. This will get me within a much more accurate lining up with Polaris than anything I've ever used in the past. It does something called plate solving. And so it'll actually take a picture of the sky, and based on the stars it sees, it'll tell you what those stars are, and it'll actually understand where it is. And by understanding where it is currently, it knows where everything else is. So if I ask it to slew to M42 or the Orion Nebula, if I'm slightly off, it'll take a picture, it'll plate solve, and then realize that M42 is over here, and it'll automatically move the mount over for me. So that is a big change, because before, to have plate solving, you had to be connected to the internet. Well, if you're sitting up in Crestview Park, there's no internet access. All that plate solving math is in that little computer. Next big one is having control over your mount and also your camera. So taking exposures, how many, duration, all that's controlled on the iPad. Same with the guiding, autofocus. Again, it's all wireless. I don't have to walk around with a cable, which if anybody's ever done astrophotography in the past, old school, there's a lot of wires. And if one of those wires get caught on something, let me tell you, you can have a bad night because that mount's not stopping and whatever's connected to is coming off. And it's usually an expensive piece of equipment. So the ASI Air Pro has been a game changer for the hobby. And so this is what I use. This is my main imaging rig. And this is a Celestron C14, and it actually has something called a Hyperstar on it. And it actually converts the F ratio down to f1.9, so it's an extremely fast scope. And what it allows me to do is take 30-second exposures. And if you think about that, if I'm taking only 30-second exposures, I can image maybe 10, 15 objects a night because I'm just running through, maybe taking 10 of each object, and that's moving on. And so it's kind of an imaging beast. It also uses all of the ZWO equipment. I have that device here so I can connect it to my iPad. And you can see in that picture, that's what you actually see. That's one frame that it's taken. And so what it's allowed me to do, if I'm doing like outreach, I can have a group of people come over, actually connected to a TV out in the field, and that's what you'll see. That's the Whirlpool Galaxy, one frame, 30 seconds. So it allows you to see a lot more detail than you ever see in an eyepiece, and you don't have to actually be taking pictures. You can actually be showing people live images. So let's talk about the main goals. And I know on this picture here, if you're doing astrophotography specifically at Crestview Park, you're going to see one or all three of these items. And I know Mike has seen the gentleman with the flashlight, I think a few times. I've met him once because usually you're the first one to arrive at Crestview and you're always the last one to leave because you have a lot of equipment to set up and you have a lot of equipment to set down or take down. But the key for astrophotography, once you get set up, is take the longest exposures your equipment or conditions allow. And so, as I said, 30-second exposures, there's actually a calculator in terms of what object you're going to look at, how long you need to expose it based on your F ratio, and what you're looking to accomplish. So it varies. There's no set length of exposure. But you want to take the longest you can because you want to gather the most amount of light as possible. The next is you want to take as many as you can. One of the keys here is when you're done, you actually take all these photos you've collected and then you merge them. And they call it stacking in astrophotography. And that's what gives you that clear, crisp photo based on pretty much averaging all the photos together into one master one. And there's a nice raccoon that lives in that big tree in the middle of Crestview Park. I met him on a couple nights.
Usually some deer too.
Yeah. All right, so where does astrophotography start for me? Well, on a night I'm going out, I actually start at home. So I start out with a plan, I go ahead and I select all the deep space objects I want to photograph, and it's important because I want to go ahead and keep my mount movement minimized. And part of that is if I start moving my mount around, I'm starting to introduce errors into the mount. So if I'm going to go ahead and do a session, I'm just going to walk right up the Milky Way as it rotates into the telescope. So I can start where that yellow line is, and basically by the duration of taking a shot of this one, this next object is going to be very close to it. So as I slew to the next object, I only have to move a very little bit. And what that allows me to do is keeps the telescope on the same side of the mount, keeps the gearing on the same side of the mount, keeps the weight on the same side of the mount, and my mount is going to be much more accurate because I'm still doing tracking kind of in the same general area. I can keep my guiding going as well, so I don't have to reset the guiding in terms of recalibration, because if I move my mount 180 degrees, I have just introduced all kinds of errors into my pointing. So again, right side of the mount. I learned that from Hanan. Also, what you would want to do, and I've done this, I'm a victim of this myself, and it's self-inflicted, but you want to test your rig at home. One of the things you don't want to do is when you get a new piece of equipment and just rush up to Crestview, set up in the dark, and realize that you did it wrong or it doesn't work, and then you got to tear it down in the dark. And I've done that on many occasions, and it's not fun. So again, set it up at home, get it focused, make sure it works, make sure it's talking to each other, and then again, you can move on. Coming into Crestview, I usually get there early. Location, I select a location that's very dark. There's different locations that you don't want to be behind a tree. You want to make sure you can see the Polaris. You want to be able to make sure you can see the object for the duration of the night. And also, very important, you want to make sure you have a level and balanced mount. It's not only aligning your mount to Polaris, but making sure that it's balanced is key, because then you want the motors to be straining, which again, introduce errors into your tracking. And then last but not least, wire management. As I said, that mount there, if that wire catches on something, it's not even gonna slow down. It's just gonna take whatever it caught on right off the whole mount. And that would be a bad, expensive night. All right. So this here is actually a picture of doing a focus run. The way these things work, it starts taking pictures. And the electronic focuser will start turning, and it'll be looking at a single star. And it'll actually start looking at a star and see if it gets smaller or bigger. And what we'll do is keep adjusting it until it finds the smallest that star will focus at. And that's your focus point. And in the case of my setup here, it'll do it automatically. It'll do it in between pictures if you set it up that way, or in between objects, or if the temperature changes. And so one of the things it has a temperature sensor. And again, this is part of the ASI Air setup, because as the temperature changes, your equipment will change. It'll actually change focus. And that focus range that you have is maybe a 1/16 of an inch. So it has to be adjusted constantly, and it has to be very accurate. The next thing you do is polar alignment. Now, fortunate for me, instead of getting on your knees and looking through the polar alignment scope, it's been totally changed. It does it electronically. And in essence, it's kind of gamified the whole situation. Whereas it'll take a picture, and then you adjust the mount screws until this little pip here goes into the middle. And that'll give you almost dead-on polar alignment. I've never seen it easier. I've tried all different methods. This has been the easiest I've ever seen. And again, what we'll do here is we'll set up, one of the keys that you have to understand is if the mount knows where everything is in the sky, it still has to know what time it is, it has to know the date. And we'll go ahead and enter that in, do a plate solve. Once we have that identified, now it has the whole sky mapped out. And in essence, it'll be able to track, it'll be able to find objects, it'll do all the math for you, and you can actually start your imaging sequence, which is next. So generally what we do is we go to the first object in the schedule, we do a precision focus because we moved it. We'll start guiding. Again, this is the missile lock, so this is the camera that's on top. This is what it sees. It'll automatically select a guide star, do a quick calibration, and it'll keep that piece or that star in that same pixel for the entire duration until you tell it otherwise. And that'll translate into a much clearer picture from your imaging camera. Excuse me. And then we'll go ahead and we'll start the imaging run. And this will be how many pictures I tell it to take, what's the duration of that picture or that exposure. And here's an example. This is just this is a little bit longer exposure, but this is the Orion Nebula. You can see just in that setup, you can get color pretty quickly in that setup at F2 that you can't get otherwise. And so this is, again, a nice way to bring somebody into like outreach and kind of give them a live shot that normally you wouldn't see visually, and actually be able to kind of pick out the color in the object. So there's another set of pictures you have to take as part of astrophotography. in any imaging system, from the most expensive to the cheapest, there's going to be inherent imperfections that you have to, again, identify and then be able to bring to post-processing to remove from the picture. And there's 3 different frames you have to take. You have to take a flat, bias, and dark. The flat frame are kind of tricky, but basically it's taking a picture of your optical train, and that'll remove any vignetting or dust from the lenses, mirrors that get recorded by the camera. And so really what this is, you'll see me at the Crestview Park with a t-shirt over the end of it, over the end of the imaging scope with a light source, usually my iPad, or if it's the C14, I have an LED pad. And the camera will take a picture of that and it'll be able to pick out all those items from taking that kind of frame. Bias is a very fast picture, less than a second. It's recording the sensor noise. Again, that was that electrical charge I was telling you about earlier. You can actually go ahead and record that and save that, so later on as you're doing your processing, subtract that noise. The same with the dark. The dark is actually taking your lens cap, putting it over the end of the camera, and taking the same length of picture as you did for your image. And that'll pick up any of the thermal noise that perhaps your cooler wasn't able to remove out of the image. So again, you'll have 3 additional images to bring home. So let's say you went out for your first night, your spouse knows how much you spent on all the equipment, and you get home and you're like, come here, you gotta see this picture I took. Right? It doesn't end here, unfortunately. These cameras record in a format that's not a JPEG. It's actually what they call a FITS file. It's a scientific type of file that records data. You'll hear people talk about that even at the James Webb telescopes, the same theory. They're collecting data, they're not collecting the image. And so that's what you see when you open up the file. You have to go into the next phase, which is now all software, which is, well, before we get there, there's other things you're going to discover too. So in that time you spent recording your long shots, you're going to find a lot of these. I would say 10% of my shots nowadays are recording satellites, airplanes, or something else, a car driving into Crestview. And so that's actually on the left there, that is one of the Starlink satellites. I think on the right here is an airplane going across the screen. And since we photograph at Crestview, you get a lot of SFO and San Jose flights coming over. In fact, if you spend time up there during a star party, look through the visual eyepiece, you'll see, if you sit there long enough, you'll see a satellite cross the eyepiece. I was just reading an article yesterday that there's companies that are planning to launch thousands of these things up into low Earth orbit in the next couple of years. So there's going to be a lot of these in your photos. So post-processing. So you made it home, you showed your spouse that dark picture. Now they're demanding return on investment. And so now you got to do battle. This is the part of the hobby that really hasn't advanced in the past couple of years. It's difficult, I'll admit, it's the most difficult part, which is taking all that data and trying to make a picture of something, okay? The trick here is you take all that information, all those images and all those calibration frames, and you smash it down into one master frame. And then there's the process of actually taking it through kind of an effort to bring out the color, right? If you have a one-shot color camera, it's actually not color. It's actually degrees of gray, and you assign each of those channels a color. I did something on purpose here because you can change the colors. A color camera doesn't take natural colors. You can actually take a blue channel and make it yellow. And so if you ever seen the Hubble palette or the Hubble photographs, they're like in shades of yellow, green, and blue. You can actually recreate those with the same data you're taking with these one-shot color cameras. You actually just change the actual color of the data for that particular channel. Red can become green, green can become red. You do that all in software. But basically it's a couple steps. You balance the color, you denoise the image, you make outer space black, because when it comes out of the camera, it's usually green. And then you sharpen, set the contrast, and you calibrate it. and hopefully your focus was spot on, and the end result, you'll come up with an image, you convert it to a TIFF and JPEG, put it on Facebook, call it a day. The key here is, this part here is an art and not a science. So you could take the same set of data, give it to 5 different astronomers, you'll get 5 different results. I've done this with Hanan, who's another astrophotographer in the club, same set of data. Came back, they look totally different. So again, it's an art, it's just not a science. So it's kind of the interpretation of what the object should look like. The key to know is, colors in space aren't as bright as in some of these pictures. It's just not the fact. But the goal is to come up with a repeatable process that you can apply to the same images over and over. Because then it'll kind of give you a way to take, usually will take 3-4 hours, you can develop a picture in maybe 20 minutes. And people have developed workflow to make that happen. I've done that. So here's my workflow. So I can actually do this in about 20 minutes because I'm used to it and I've automated some of the steps, but I use a software called PixInsight. And PixInsight, you can actually, I think they use it for some of the JWST photos. It's a very complex piece of software. It's hard to learn, but it allows you to process these very detailed photos. And actually, you can download the James Webb data and try it yourself if you want. I haven't tried it yet, but I'll see it. I'm sure my photo won't look as good as theirs. So I've actually collected a number of photos from people in the club, myself, Michael Cook, who uses one of the EV scopes, and we'll have some of those pictures here. Hanan, who actually shoots with a different kind of setup than I do. He actually has a big refractor, which kind of gives a different perspective on things than my Hyperstar setup. But we have this slideshow. Unfortunately, we're on a lower end projector, so the photos aren't going to look half as good as they do on my screen. We just weren't able to get the 4K projector to work. So we'll go ahead and end with this slideshow, and then we'll take some questions. Okay, bring those up. Somebody, if you want to come up, anybody have any questions? Anybody need advice for Christmas?
How many Christmas stockings do you have?
What's that?
How big a Christmas stocking do you have?
I spent my allowance, so my stocking this year is small. Yes.
I agree with your statements about ZWO. I spent more than a few paychecks on their equipment and I love it.
Yeah, it's a total game changer.
It is. The question I have, you mentioned that there's a online calculator of sorts that tells you how long to expose for a given thing you want to target.
Yeah.
Do you have a reference for that? I'm curious.
Let's say astronomy.tools.
Astronomy, same place. Okay,
Yeah,
great.
and so there's a couple others, but that seems to be the one I keep coming back to. A lot of information in there. It'll take you a week to unpack it all.